Hays, Kansas. June 1945. The day started the same way every day started. 5:30. The light coming through the barracks window still gray and uncertain, not yet committed to being morning. The sound of women moving in the dark. The specific economy of people who have learned to dress, fold, and prepare in silence without being asked to. Ilse Brenner laced her boots and put her hand in her pocket. The pencil was there. She checked for it the way you check for something you cannot explain keeping. Not because you need it, but because its absence would mean something you are not ready to name. A carpenter's pencil, flat and wide. The wood worn smooth where her father's thumb had rested for 20 years. She had taken it from his workbench the morning after the funeral without thinking. She had been carrying it for 8 months. She put it back and stood up. Roll call at 6. 23 women in 2 rows in the yard. The Kansas morning already warm at the edges. The sky enormous and indifferent above the fence line. Corporal James Whitfield moved down the row calling names from his clipboard in the careful pronunciation of a man who had learned them phonetically and was not going to get them wrong. He never got them wrong. Ilse answered when her name came and looked straight ahead and thought about nothing. Breakfast at 6:30. The mess hall smelled of coffee and something hot. Oatmeal, toast, a ladle of something that approximated jam. Ilse carried her tray to the table and sat. Across from her, Marta Vogel was already seated. She had been seated before anyone else arrived, which was a thing Marta did, positioned early, facing the door, her tray in front of her untouched, while she conducted her daily examination. She picked up the toast and turned it over. She lifted the edge of the oatmeal with her spoon and looked at what was underneath. She set the spoon down. It's the same as yesterday, Ilse said. Yes, Marta said. She picked up the spoon again and began to eat. This was not suspicion exactly. It was something more disciplined than suspicion, a methodology, applied consistently, that had kept Marta Vogel alive and intact through 4 years of a war that had not been kind to people who stopped paying attention. Ilse had watched her do it every morning for 3 weeks, and had stopped finding it remarkable. It was simply Marta, the way the pencil was simply the pencil. Agnes Free sat down at the end of the table with her tray and her habitual silence. She was 26 years old and from Hamburg, and she watched things. Not with Marta's forensic attention. Agnes watched the way water watches, absorbing everything, reflecting back only what she chose to reflect. She looked at Marta. She looked at Ilse. She looked at her oatmeal and began to eat. After breakfast, kitchen detail. For women washing the previous day's pots, the water hot enough to turn their hands red, the work rhythmic and thoughtless enough to leave the mind free to go where it wanted. Ilse's mind went to the board outside the administration building. The voluntary work list had appeared 3 days ago. Corporal Whitfield had posted it without announcement, simply pinned it to the board one morning and walked away. It offered positions at local farms, a pharmacy in town, the camp laundry, basic maintenance. 25 cents per day in camp currency, redeemable at the canteen. No obligation. Women who did not wish to participate were not required to explain themselves. Ilse had read it twice on the first day and walked away. She had read it again yesterday and walked away again. The problem was not the work. The problem was the word voluntary, the way it sat on the page looking simple and open, the way simple and open things had a way of meaning something else entirely when you were 23 years old and 4,000 miles from home in a country that had been your enemy 6 weeks ago. Voluntary was a door, and doors that stood open in her experience either led somewhere you wanted to go or were left open specifically because someone wanted you to walk through them. She rinsed a pot and put it on the rack. After kitchen detail, laundry. After laundry, 2 hours of free time in the yard or the common room. The afternoon settled into its accustomed shape. Women reading, women writing letters, women sitting in the particular suspended quiet of people who are waiting for their lives to resume. The English class had appeared in the common room on Monday. 2 women from a local church, Mrs. Dorothy Crane, perhaps 60, and her daughter Patricia, perhaps 30, had set up a small folding table with primers and pencils and a handwritten sign in German that said English lessons. Welcome, free of charge. They had sat there for the first hour with no students. Then 3 women had drifted over, cautiously, as though approaching something that might move suddenly, and sat down. Ilse had watched from across the room. Marta had watched from the window, standing with her arms crossed, the afternoon light behind her making her expression difficult to read. She had not moved toward the table. She had not moved away from it either. She had simply watched with the attention of someone cataloging a thing whose purpose was not yet clear. Today Agnes had gone. She had not announced it. She had simply picked up her cup of coffee and walked across the common room and sat down at the end of the table near Patricia Crane and opened the primer to the first page. Ilse had watched her go. Marta had watched from the window. The church sends them, Marta said. She was not speaking to anyone in particular. Ilse did not answer. They send people who speak German. The farmer will speak German. The pharmacist will speak German. She turned from the window. It is a system. Everything here is a system. Everything everywhere is a system, Ilse said. Marta looked at her. Not every system wants something from you. She went back to her bunk. Ilse went back to the board. She stood in front of it for a long time. The list was still there, the pencil on its string still hanging beside it, the entries still in Corporal Whitfield's careful handwriting. Farm work outside Hayes, Callaway property. She read the name. She read the work description. She read the word voluntary again, and felt the same thing she had felt the first 2 times. The open door, the question of what it led to. She thought about Marta's word. System. She thought about 3 weeks of waiting for the worst. The clean bunks. The hot food. The guards who said good morning and meant nothing by it, and nothing happened afterward. The oatmeal that was the same as yesterday and the day before that. The 23 days during which the worst had not arrived, and she had been waiting for it so consistently and with such sustained attention that she was more tired of waiting than she was afraid. She picked up the pencil on the string. She signed her name. She put the pencil down and walked back to the barracks without looking at the board again. The truck came the next morning at 7. It was a standard army transport, canvas sides, wooden bench seats, the same truck that moved everything in 1945. Private First Class Danny Kowalski was behind the wheel with his clipboard on the seat beside him. He was 22 and from Pittsburgh, and he had the specific quality of someone whose job required him to be in many places without being the most important thing in any of them. He checked names against his list as the women climbed in. He checked the time. He noted the weather, clear, warm, on his form. Ilse climbed into the truck and sat on the bench and put her hand in her pocket. The pencil was there. The truck started. The camp gate, open, as it always was, the wooden crossbar with Camp Hayes painted in black, passed above them and fell behind. The Kansas road opened ahead, flat and straight, running through wheat fields that went to the horizon without interruption. The sky above them was the same sky it always was, enormous, unhurried, belonging to no one. Ilse watched it through the gap in the canvas. She had signed the list. She did not know yet what she had signed it toward. But she was moving, which was different from waiting, and the difference, small, uncertain, costing her nothing yet, felt like something. The truck rolled through the Kansas morning toward the Callaway property. If you're enjoying this journey, leave a like and subscribe to keep up with the next chapters. I love seeing how far these stories reach, so drop a comment below and let me know which corner of the United States you're watching from today. The Callaway property appeared at the end of a dirt road. Ilse saw the house first. White clapboard, 2 stories, a porch running the full width of the front, a screen door that caught the morning light. Then the barn, red and practical, larger than the house. Then the fields beyond both, wheat stretching in every direction to a horizon that had nothing on it. A water tower, a chicken coop, a truck older than Danny's parked beside the barn with 1 tire off and a jack underneath it. Everything was working. Everything had paint on it. She noticed the paint specifically, not because it was remarkable, but because it had stopped being remarkable somewhere in Germany around 1943, when the maintenance of ordinary things quietly became impossible and nobody announced it. It simply stopped happening. Peeling walls, broken gutters left broken, the specific gray of buildings that had been bombed or simply neglected through 4 years of a country, pointing everything it had in one direction. Here the barn was red. The house was white. The fence posts were straight. Danny stopped the truck. 3 women climbed down. Ilse, Greta from Munich, Clara from somewhere she hadn't said. A man came from the direction of the barn. Howard Callaway was 58 years old and built the way Kansas builds men. Wide through the shoulders, unhurried in his movement, a face that had been in the sun long enough to stop distinguishing between weather and time. He wore canvas trousers and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow and a hat that had been good once and had been maintained through whatever years had passed since. He looked at the 3 women with the expression of a man completing an assessment he has already mostly completed. "Welcome," he said. "Work starts at the barn." He turned and walked back toward it. The barn smelled of hay and animals, and the particular warm darkness of enclosed spaces that have held living things for a long time. Howard showed them the chickens first, the coop attached to the barn's east side, perhaps 40 birds, the morning feed in a metal bucket hanging on a nail. He demonstrated once, lifted the latch, entered, scattered the feed with a particular wrist motion that distributed it evenly. He stepped back out and looked at Ilse. She went in. The chickens moved around her feet with the organized indifference of creatures that have learned to associate human presence with food and do not complicate it further. She scattered the feed the way Howard had shown her. Some went wrong. Too far left, a clump in the corner, but the chickens found it and nobody commented. She came back out. Howard was already at the next thing. The water trough for the pigs, a pump beside the barn that required 2 hands and a specific rhythm. He worked it until water came, showed her the rhythm, stepped back. She worked the pump. Wrong twice, right on the 3rd attempt. Howard moved on. This was how the morning went. He showed. She did. He moved to the next thing. No commentary, no performed patience, no assessment delivered out loud. Simply the assumption that she would figure it out, built into the pace of the morning itself. She fell into it without deciding. See, do, and move on. The rhythm of it already familiar from somewhere. She didn't reach for consciously. Greta and Clara were directed to the vegetable garden where Ruth Calloway was already working. Ilsa stayed at the barn with Howard, which happened without announcement. Simply a consequence of direction and task. Both of them moving through the morning's work without pausing to categorize it. By mid-morning she had fed the chickens, worked the pump, helped carry feed sacks from the supply shed to the barn, and held the end of a fence rail while Howard drove the post. None of it was heavy. All of it was purposeful. There was a satisfaction in it she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific satisfaction of a morning that has produced something visible by the end of it. In the camp the mornings produced a clean floor, a dry laundry line, a counted row of women standing straight for roll call. These were not nothing, but they were the maintenance of a situation, not the building of anything. Here something was different, and she couldn't name it precisely except to notice that by 11 o'clock she was tired in a way that felt useful. At noon Ruth appeared at the barn door. She was 54 years old with a face organized around a directness that had nothing defensive in it, the specific openness of someone who has never needed to manage how they appear to other people. She wore a house dress and an apron with flour on it from the morning. She looked at Ilsa and said, "Come eat." The kitchen was large and practical, a table that could seat 8 set for 5. Ruth had been cooking since early morning, something with meat, bread still warm from the oven, vegetables that had come from the garden that morning and smelled of it. She moved between the stove and the table with the efficiency of someone for whom this kitchen was an extension of her own thinking. She looked at Ilsa in the doorway and reached behind her without pausing, took an apron from the hook beside the door, and held it out. Not a question, just the apron. Ilsa put it on. Howard sat at the head of the table and bowed his head. For sentences, plain and unhurried. She caught Robert and Thomas and grateful, and the last word was amen. He picked up his fork. Everyone ate. The food was real. That was what kept returning to her throughout the meal. Not the abundance of it, though the portions were generous in a way that would have been impossible in Freiburg for 2 years running. Not the quality, though Ruth's cooking was good and clearly had been good for a long time. But the realness of it. Actual meat with actual texture, bread with actual weight, the specific flavor of food grown by the same hands that prepared it. In the last year in Germany food had become a category more than a substance. You ate what was available, and the eating was functional, and the flavor was beside the point. She had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing cold. Not because it gets better, but because noticing it costs more than it gives you. She noticed this. Ruth refilled her water glass without being asked. She was already back at the stove before Ilsa could respond. After the meal, Howard pushed back his chair and looked at Ilsa. "Good first morning," he said. Then he went back outside. Ilsa stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding his plate. She carried it to the sink. Ruth looked at her from across the kitchen. "You learn fast," she said. 3 words, said the way you say something you simply believe to be true. Ruth went back to the dishes. Ilsa stood at the sink with the warm water running over her hands. She was not accustomed to being told she had done something well by someone who had no particular reason to say so. In the auxiliary, assessment arrived as formal evaluation, filed, noted, useful to the system. This was different. Ruth had said it the way Howard said, "Good first morning." Not as evaluation, but as observation. A fact reported. The afternoon was quieter. Howard in the field, the women with Ruth on the porch shelling beans, the Kansas heat pressing against everything beyond the porch roof shade. The work was repetitive and allowed for the sitting together that doesn't require conversation. Once Ruth looked at her directly. "Where are you from?" "Freiburg," Ilsa said. Ruth repeated it carefully. "Is it pretty?" Ilsa thought about the Black Forest. The way the morning light came through it in summer. The river. Her mother's kitchen window looking out over the street where nothing had been bombed yet. "Yes," she said. "There are mountains. And a river." "I've never seen mountains," Ruth said. Without longing, simply as fact. Howard went to Colorado once. Said they were something. She went back to her beans. The question had been asked with no agenda. Pure curiosity. The specific interest of a woman who wants to know where a person comes from. Ilsa had not been asked where she came from in 3 weeks. She had been processed and documented and assigned. She had been a name on a list. Nobody had asked if Freiburg was pretty. At 4 o'clock the truck came back around. Howard stood at the gate while the women climbed in. He looked at Ilsa last and reached into his shirt pocket. He counted coins into his palm and held them out. 25 cents. Counted precisely, held out the way you offer something that belongs to someone. Not a gift, not charity, the correct conclusion of an exchange between two people who have each done what they agreed to do. She took them. 7 o'clock tomorrow, Howard said. Back at camp, she put the coins on the shelf and sat on her bunk. Agnes looked up from her letter. What was it like? Ilsa thought about the paint on the barn. The pump rhythm. Ruth's apron held out without ceremony. The 4 plain sentences before the meal, and the glass of water refilled without being asked, and the 3 words at the sink. The food was real, she said. From Marta's bunk, without looking up. Naturally. You don't get a bird into a cage by showing it the bars first. Ilsa lay back and looked at the ceiling. She didn't argue. She didn't have the words for it yet. The specific thing that had been different today, the quality that Marta's explanation almost fit, but didn't quite. Almost. The explanation was close enough to be convincing if you hadn't been there. She had been there. She closed her eyes and let the Kansas evening settle around the camp and thought about 7 o'clock tomorrow with something that was not yet hope, but was no longer only suspicion. The second week settled into a pattern. Ilsa, Greta, and Clara on the truck at 7. Howard at the gate. The barn first. The chickens, the pump, the feed sacks, and then whatever the morning required after that. The work changed day to day in its specifics, but not in its quality. Purposeful, physical, producing something visible by noon. She was getting better at the pump. The chickens had stopped startling when she entered. Small things. But small things accumulate. What did not accumulate was the conversation in the barracks. 3 days after the first visit, Ilsa had made the mistake of describing the noon meal in detail. The bread, the vegetables, the meat. She had not meant it as a report. She had been talking to Agnes, quietly, in the evening, and Marta had been on her bunk with a book open in her lap that she may or may not have been reading. Roast pork, Marta said, without looking up. On a Tuesday. Yes. Not tinned. Not rationed. No. Marta turned a page. A Kansas farmer feeding enemy prisoners roast pork on a Tuesday. She let the sentence sit for a moment. And you find nothing to examine in that. I find things to examine in everything, Ilsa said. I just don't always reach the same conclusions you do. Marta looked up for the first time. Her expression was not hostile. It was something more controlled than hostility, the specific patience of someone who has decided to explain something once, and only once. They are constructing something, she said. Every meal, every pleasant guard, every fair payment, it is construction. You are being built into something useful to them. Comfortable. Compliant. The bird doesn't fight the cage it can't see. She looked back at her book. Enjoy the pork. Agnes said nothing. She was writing her letter with the careful attention of someone who had decided not to have an opinion tonight. Ilsa went to sleep thinking about roast pork and cages, and whether the difference between a cage you can see and a cage you cannot was as meaningful as Marta believed, or whether at a certain point the question of the cage mattered less than what was happening inside you while you stood in it. She didn't reach a conclusion. She fell asleep before she got there. On Thursday of the second week, Howard was repairing the tractor. Not the full engine, a belt that had worn through, a bracket that had bent out of alignment during the previous day's field work. He had the tools laid out beside him in the specific order of a man who has repaired this machine enough times to know what he will need before he needs it. He worked with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom mechanical failure was a normal condition of life rather than a crisis. Ilsa had finished with the animals and come around the barn to find him there. She stopped. He glanced at her, then back at the engine. "Hand me that," he said, without pointing, trusting that she would understand from context. The wrench, the obvious next tool, the one that came after the one in his hand. She understood. She handed it. He worked. She watched. After a moment she crouched beside him because standing above someone working felt wrong. Her father had never liked people standing above him when he worked, said it made him feel observed rather than assisted. Howard glanced at her again, not surprised, as if her crouching beside him was the logical next thing after handing him the wrench. "Belt's gone," he said, nodding at the worn rubber. "Happens every season. Machine doesn't care how much you need it. Can you fix it yourself?" "Already am." She watched him work the bracket back into alignment, small adjustments, patient, testing the position after each one. Her father had worked the same way, not rushing toward the finished thing, but attending to each step as its own complete task. She had grown up watching hands work like this and had not thought about it in years. "Your sons," she said. She had heard the names in the grace, Robert and Thomas, and had been holding the question for a week. "They are in the war." Howard's hands didn't stop. "Robert's in the Pacific. Thomas is in France." A pause. The wrench turned. "Do you hear from him?" "Letters come when they come." He tested the bracket. Adjusted at a fraction. Ruth reads them first. Saves me the part where she pretends she's not worried. Something in the plainness of this, the specific, tired love in it, stopped Ilsa from saying anything. Howard wasn't asking for a response. He was simply reporting a fact about his life the way he reported everything, as though the facts of a life deserved the same steady attention as the facts of a machine. My father was a carpenter, she said, and immediately wasn't sure why she had said it. Howard looked at her. He waited. He worked the same way you do, each step completely before the next one. She paused. He died last year. Howard held the wrench and looked at the tractor for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry for it. For words. Not I'm sorry for your loss with its formal distance, not a performance of sympathy. Just the plain acknowledgement of a thing that was true and deserved acknowledging. He went back to the bracket. They worked in silence for another 20 minutes. Ilsa handing him things when he needed them, holding the belt in position while he fastened it, passing the right tool before he asked because she could read the sequence of the work well enough by now to anticipate it. When the bracket was set and the belt was fitted, he ran the engine briefly to test it. It turned over clean. He switched it off. Not bad, he said, which she understood was directed at the repair and also, in some way she did not examine too carefully, at the morning's work between the two of them. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a pencil to mark something on the maintenance log he kept on a nail inside the barn door. It was a carpenter's pencil, flat and wide, the same shape as her father's. She stared at it for a fraction of a second too long. Howard noticed, the way a man who pays attention to things notices. He said nothing. He made his note, and put the pencil back and went into the barn for the afternoon's next task. Ilsa stood beside the tractor in the Kansas sun and put her hand in her pocket. Her fingers found the familiar flat shape. She took her hand back out without taking the pencil out. Some things didn't need to be compared. Some things were simply true in two places at once. Back at camp that evening, Agnes was at the English class table in the common room, working through the primer with a concentration she didn't apply to much else. Patricia Crane sat beside her, pointing at words, waiting while Agnes formed the pronunciation. Ilsa sat nearby and watched, and did not join. Marta was at the window. She had been at the window for 20 minutes looking at the yard with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she had not yet finished thinking. The teacher, she said, without turning. The younger one. She asked Frida about her family today. Agnes looked up from the primer. Personal questions, Marta continued. Friendly. Interested. Exactly the kind of questions you ask when you want someone to feel known. She turned from the window. Exactly. Perhaps she was simply interested, Agnes said carefully. Perhaps. Marta came back to her bunk and sat. Or perhaps making prisoners feel known is a more effective tool than making them feel afraid. Cheaper, certainly. And the results last longer. The room was quiet for a moment. Howard asked me nothing today, Ilsa said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out as a simple fact in response to a simple argument. We fixed the tractor. He said 4 sentences. None of them were questions. Marta looked at her with the expression of someone who has already accounted for this. Not everyone in the system needs to ask questions, she said. Some of them are just the cage itself. She opened her book. Agnes looked at Ilsa. Ilsa looked at the ceiling. Outside the camp the Kansas evening was going dark slowly, the way it did out here. Not the sudden dark of cities but a long, gradual withdrawal of light that gave you time to notice it leaving. Somewhere 4 miles down the road Ruth Calloway was finishing the dishes and Howard was reading the paper, and somewhere in the Pacific and in France 2 young men, named Robert and Thomas, were doing whatever soldiers did when the day's fighting was done. Ilsa thought about I'm sorry for it. For words, and then back to the bracket. She thought about the pencil in Howard's pocket and the pencil in hers, and the way certain shapes recurred in the world without it meaning anything supernatural. Simply the world being itself, repeating the forms that worked. She thought about Marta's word. Cage. She looked around the barracks. The bunks, the shelf, the window with its view of the fence line, and the sky above it. She had been in this room for a month, and she still did not know with certainty whether it was a cage or a room. The difference, she was beginning to suspect, was not in the walls. It was in what you brought inside them. 3 weeks in, Ruth stopped explaining things. Not because there was nothing left to explain. The kitchen alone had produced enough small disasters to fill a notebook, including the morning Ilsa had confused salt and sugar in the biscuit dough, and Ruth had eaten one without comment, and then quietly poured the rest into the pig bucket. But somewhere in the 3rd week, the explaining shifted into something else. Ruth would start a task, and Ilsa would begin the next step without being told, and Ruth would nod the way you nod when you already expected it. The kitchen had its own rhythm now, the same way the barn had its rhythm. The same way, Ilsa was beginning to understand. Every working place develops a rhythm between 2 people who have stopped being strangers in it. She had stopped being a stranger here. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. The rutabaga appeared on a Wednesday. Ruth came in from the garden with a basket of vegetables and set it on the table and began sorting through it. At the bottom, beneath the carrots and onions, was something that looked like a turnip that had made poor decisions. Purple-gray on top, pale yellow below, shaped approximately like a fist. Ruth held it up. "Rutabaga," she said. Ilsa looked at it. "What is that?" "Dinner," Ruth said. "What is it called?" "Rutabaga." Ilsa tried the word. What came out was something that technically contained the same sounds in approximately the wrong order with an accent that reordered the emphasis entirely. Ruth stopped what she was doing. She looked at Ilsa with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it was. "Say it again," Ruth said. Ilsa said it again. Worse this time. Ruth pressed her lips together. Her shoulders moved once. Then she said it back, "Rutabaga," in a deliberate exaggeration of correctness, each syllable placed with great care, that was somehow even funnier than Ilsa's version. Ilsa said it again in her version. Ruth said it in her version. This continued for longer than the word deserved. By the fourth exchange, Ruth was laughing openly, the specific laugh of a woman who doesn't do it quietly, full and unguarded and filling the kitchen completely. Ilsa was laughing too, at herself and at Ruth laughing, the laughter feeding itself the way it does when two people have found the same thing funny at the same time and neither wants it to stop. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway with his clipboard, drawn by the noise. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Ilsa. He looked at the rutabaga on the table. He said something in English that made Ruth laugh again. Then he went back outside with his clipboard and his expression of mild professional bewilderment. The kitchen settled back into its work, both of them still smiling without trying to. That evening Ilsa opened her diary and wrote one word. Rutabaga. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the diary and went to sleep. The following Saturday, Ruth told Ilsa they were going to town. Hays, Kansas on a Saturday morning had the specific energy of a place that is functioning. Not performing function, not maintaining the appearance of it, but actually working, the way things work when the systems behind them are intact. Stores open, goods in the windows, automobiles parked in front of the hardware store and the pharmacy and the feed merchant, people moving between them with the unhurried purpose of people who have somewhere to be and expect to get there. Ilsa sat in the passenger seat of Ruth's truck and looked at all of it. She had not been in a town since before the camp. The last town she remembered properly. The last one where things were where they were supposed to be and the shops were open and the windows weren't boarded, was Freiburg before the raids. She had a specific memory of a Thursday market in 1942 that she had held on to because it was the last time she could remember a town simply being a town without the war making something of it. This was a town simply being a town. She did not say this out loud. She filed it away in the way she had been filing things for 3 weeks. Not as evidence for Marta's arguments or against them, simply as things that were true and needed to be held somewhere until she understood what they added up to. Ruth went to the feed merchant first. She moved through the transaction with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 30 years, knew the prices, knew what she needed, negotiated a quantity without drama. The merchant knew her name and asked after Howard and said something about the weather and the wheat yield that made Ruth shake her head in a way that meant agreement. Then to the hardware store, where old Mr. Pendleton stood behind the counter with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in a room full of things that fix other things and found this deeply satisfying. Ruth asked for wire, a specific gauge, a specific quantity. Mr. Pendleton found it, set it on the counter, wrote a number on the receipt. Ruth looked at the receipt. She looked at Mr. Pendleton. "Harold," she said. "Ruth," he said, with the expression of a man who has been caught doing something and does not intend to stop. Ruth looked at the number again. The number was lower than the price on the tag behind the counter by enough to be intentional and not enough to be argued about. She folded the receipt and put it in her purse. "Give my best to Dorothy," she said. "Always do," said Mr. Pendleton. They left. Ilsa had watched the entire exchange without speaking. Outside on the sidewalk, she turned it over in her mind. The number on the receipt, the look between them, Ruth's 2 words and Mr. Pendleton's 2 words, and the whole transaction conducted in the specific language of people who have known each other long enough that most of it doesn't need to be said. A discount given not from policy or program, but from one person's private decision that Howard Calloway's boys were overseas, and that meant something, and the wire should cost less. No announcement. No ceremony. No form to fill out. She thought about the word community and what it was supposed to mean, and what she had been told it meant, and whether what she had just watched in the hardware store was closer to the idea than anything she had seen the word actually produce. The bakery was the last stop. Danny was outside it, which surprised Ilsa. She had not known he was in town today. He was standing on the sidewalk with his clipboard, apparently having just completed a check of the pharmacy 2 doors down, where 2 other camp women worked. The baker came out of the door behind him with a small paper bag and held it out. Danny looked at it. "Boys need to eat," the baker said. He was a large man with flour on his apron and the plain, unhurried manner of someone stating something he considered self-evident. Danny took the bag. He said something, a thanks, short and genuine. The baker went back inside. Ilsa watched Danny stand on the sidewalk with the paper bag and his clipboard. He looked slightly embarrassed by it, the way people look when they have received something they didn't ask for and don't know the correct response to. He put the bag under his arm and wrote something on his form and moved on to the next site. She kept watching the spot where the baker had stood. In Germany, soldiers were thanked with a specific public solemnity, ceremony, speeches, the formal machinery of a state that needed its soldiers to understand they were valued because the state required them to keep going. It was not nothing. But it was not the same as a baker coming out of his shop with a bag of rolls, because boys need to eat. The difference, she thought, was that the baker had not been asked. Howard was at the kitchen table when they returned, the newspaper open in front of him, a cup of coffee at his elbow that had probably been there long enough to be cold. He was reading something that was displeasing him. She could see it in the set of his jaw before she could see what the page said. "The mayor," Ruth said, before he could speak, setting the wire on the counter. 50 cents on the property tax, Howard said. "Man's been in office 3 years, and he spent the whole time finding new ways to take money that wasn't his to begin with. You say that every year. Every year, he gives me new reasons." Howard turned the page with some force. "Next election, I'm driving every man on this road to the polling place myself." Ruth put the kettle on. "You said that last time too." "Last time I meant it less." Ilsa stood at the edge of the kitchen and listened to this with a specific quality of attention she couldn't have explained. Not the content of it, which was local and particular and none of her business, but the texture of it. A man saying in his own kitchen that the mayor was taking money that wasn't his. Out loud. To his wife. While reading the paper. Irritated, specific, planning to do something about it through the mechanism available to him. In Germany, you did not say the government was taking money that wasn't its to begin with. Not in your kitchen, not to your wife, not out loud. Not by 1942. Perhaps not earlier. She had been young and not paying the kind of attention she was paying now. She had not thought of this as a freedom specifically. It had simply been one of the things that stopped. The casual political complaint, the open irritation with authority, the assumption that your opinion of the mayor was your own business, and you could say it to whoever was in the room. Howard turned another page. "You want coffee?" He was asking Ilsa. She realized it a half-second late. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Ruth was already reaching for the cup. The following Thursday, the neighbor's tractor broke down 2 fields over. Ilsa heard it from the chicken coop, or rather she heard the silence where the machine had been, the specific absence of sound that meant something had stopped working. Howard heard it too. He put down what he was doing, walked to the fence line, looked over. Then he went to the barn and got his tools. He did not say anything to anyone. He went through the fence gate and across the field. 20 minutes later, a second man came from the direction of the road, a neighboring property, Ilsa assumed, someone who had also heard the silence. He had his own tools. He and Howard worked together on the machine without greeting each other extensively. The way men work together when the work is the point. By the time Ilsa brought the afternoon water out, they had it running. The neighbor packed his tools. Howard packed his. They exchanged perhaps 4 sentences total, and Howard came back through the gate and went back to what he had been doing before, without mentioning it. Ilsa stood at the fence for a moment. She thought about a word she had grown up with, Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. She had heard it in speeches, read it in newspapers, seen it on posters. It was supposed to describe a bond between Germans, a unity of purpose and blood and shared destiny that elevated the individual into something greater. It was the word the regime used to explain why sacrifice was required, and why the sacrifice was worth it, and why those who would not sacrifice were enemies of the whole. She had believed in it the way you believe in things that are named before you are old enough to examine the naming. But she also knew what the word had produced in practice. She knew about the neighbor who reported the family on the corner for listening to a foreign radio broadcast. She knew about the schoolteacher in Freiburg who had been taken away in 1939 after a student, a child, 12 years old, repeated something the teacher had said in class to his father, who had repeated it to someone else. She knew the particular way people had learned to speak in rooms, the slight lowering of the voice, the glance at the door, the sentence that stopped itself one word before the dangerous one. The Volksgemeinschaft had required this too. The unity of the people had been maintained, in no small part, by the people watching each other. Howard had just helped fix a neighbor's tractor. He had not named it anything. He had not needed the neighbor to prove his loyalty first, or checked whether helping him might be observed and misinterpreted, or weighed the cost of being seen to associate with someone who might later become inconvenient. He had simply heard the silence and gone through the gate. She wasn't sure which version of the thing was more real, but she was beginning to develop a suspicion. That evening in the barracks, Marta was in her usual corner when Ilsa came in. Her jaw was set in a way it hadn't been yesterday. Tighter, effortful, the specific compression of someone controlling something physical. She was not reading. She was simply sitting with her arms crossed, and her back straight, and her jaw tight. Ilsa noticed, and said nothing. Agnes noticed too, from across the room. They did not look at each other about it. Ilsa sat on her bunk and thought about the baker and the paper bag and the neighbor's tractor and the mayor who was taking money that wasn't his. Marta spoke first. "You've been going 3 weeks," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. And every evening you come back looking like someone who has seen something she can't explain." Marta's voice was even. "That is the intended effect. You understand that. I understand that you think so. The farmer thanks you. He pays you fairly. He treats you as though your labor has dignity. The townspeople are warm to the soldiers." She unfolded her arms. "It is a very complete picture. Very consistent. Consistency in a picture should make you more suspicious, not less. Real life is not consistent. Real life has corners." Ilsa was quiet for a moment. "A baker gave Danny a bag of rolls today," she said. "Because he said boys need to eat. Nobody asked him to. Nobody was watching." Marta looked at her with the specific patience of someone explaining something to a person they have not given up on entirely. "People perform kindness most convincingly when they believe no one is watching," she said. "That is when the performance costs them the least." Agnes put her book down very quietly. Ilsa looked at Marta. She thought about saying, "Then what would convince you?" She thought about asking what evidence, in what form, delivered by whom, would be sufficient to move Marta from her position. She didn't ask, because she was not sure Marta had an answer, and she was not sure that Marta's not having an answer was the same as Marta being wrong. She was sure of something else. The specific quality of the baker's face when he said boys need to eat. The flour on his apron. The way Danny had looked at the bag like a man who has forgotten that people do things like this. "Good night, Marta," she said. Marta said nothing. Her jaw was tight again. Agnes picked her book back up and said nothing either. The Kansas nights settled around the camp, and Ilsa lay in her bunk and thought about rutabagas and wire receipts and a man going through a fence gate because a neighbor's machine had stopped and nobody was keeping score. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. History is made of small details. If you enjoy this kind of content, leave a like and subscribe to follow the journey. And tell me in the comments, where in US are you watching this video? The barn door had been wrong for 2 weeks. Not dramatically wrong. It still opened and closed, still latched, still kept the animals where they were supposed to be. But the bottom hinge had worked loose from the frame, and the door dragged slightly on the left side, leaving a groove in the dirt and requiring a specific lift-in pull to close it properly. Howard had been compensating for it automatically every time he passed through. The small unconscious adjustment of a man who has lived with a thing long enough to absorb it into his body. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th week, he looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things, not with irritation, but with the calm assessment of a man deciding that today was the day. He got the tools. It was afternoon work, the kind that required the door to be propped open and the hinge plate removed entirely before anything useful could be done. Ilsa had finished with the animals and found Howard crouched at the base of the door frame, the old hinge in his hand, examining the wood where the screws had pulled through. She crouched beside him without being asked. He glanced at her, then back at the wood. "Needs a bigger plate. Screws have nothing left to hold in. Can you fill the holes first? Pack them." He looked at her. "With what?" "My father used wooden plugs. Cut them himself. Drove them in with a little glue, let them set, then rescrew into solid wood." Howard considered this for a moment with the specific consideration of a man evaluating a technique on its merits rather than its source. "That works," he said. "He did it on every door in our house," Ilsa said. He said a door that dragged was a house that had stopped paying attention. Howard almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was close. Sounds like a man who thought about things right. He stood up and went to the workshop for the dowel stock. They worked through the afternoon on it. Howard cutting the plugs, Ilsa mixing the glue, both of them waiting the necessary time for the wood to set before the next step, the work broken into its correct sequence and neither of them rushing it. The barn was warm and smelled of sawdust and the animals shifting in their stalls and the particular dry heat of a Kansas afternoon pressing through the boards. The conversation developed the way conversations develop between people working with their hands, not aimed at anything, not constructed, simply emerging in the spaces between tasks where there was nothing else to fill them. Howard talked about the farm the way he talked about most things, in specifics, without sentiment, the facts of a place he had inherited and maintained, and would eventually pass on. His father had broken the original 40 acres. Howard had added the east field in 1931, which had been a significant risk in 1931, and he said this without self-congratulation, simply as context. The barn had been rebuilt after a fire in 1938. The tractor was the second one. The first had lasted 17 years, which he considered acceptable. Ilsa listened and asked questions when the questions arose naturally. She asked about the fire. He told her, a summer lightning strike, the original structure gone in an hour, the neighbors arriving the next morning with tools and lumber without being called. He said this last part the same way he said everything, as simple fact, and Ilsa filed it beside the neighbor's broken tractor and Mr. Pendleton's receipt, and said nothing. Robert was 12 when it happened, Howard said. Stood in the yard all night watching it burn, and didn't cry once. Thomas was 10 and cried for both of them. A pause. I think about that sometimes. The way they were then. Ilsa waited. Robert went straight to the Marines when the war started. Didn't discuss it, just went. Thomas waited 6 months, agonized over it. Wrote me a letter explaining his reasoning before he told me in person. Howard tested the plug with his thumb, solid, set properly. Same fire. Same 2 boys watching it. Completely different people. Do you worry about them? Every day. He said it without drama. Ruth worries out loud. I worry into the work. Doesn't change anything either way, but you have to put it somewhere. Ilsa was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the barn door at a low angle now, catching the sawdust still suspended in the air from the cutting. My father worried the same way, she said. He would go to the workshop when something was wrong. You would hear the tools and know not to ask yet. Smart man, Howard said. He was. She paused. He didn't want the war. He didn't. He wasn't a man who wanted things like that. He just wanted his workshop and his family and his street in Freiburg to stay the way it was. She stopped. It didn't stay. Howard drove the first screw into the refilled hole. It went in clean and held. Most men don't want the wars they end up in, he said. Doesn't seem to matter much to the wars. He drove the second screw. Ilsa held the hinge plate steady and thought about her father's workshop, the smell of it, the specific order of the tools on the wall, the way he would whistle something tuneless when the work was going right. She thought about the last time she had been in it, which was before the raid, before everything, when the world had still been the world she had grown up in, and she had not yet understood that this was something that could change. She did not say any of this. She held the plate steady and Howard drove the screws, and the afternoon light moved across the barn floor. When the last screw was in, Howard stood up and swung the door. It opened clean. It closed clean. The drag was gone. Good, he said. The way he said it encompassed the door and the afternoon, and the technique borrowed from a carpenter in Freiburg who had never met a Kansas farmer and never would. He gathered the tools. Ilsa stayed for a moment with her hand on the door frame, feeling the solid wood where the plugs had set. He would have liked this place, she said, quietly, not quite to Howard. Howard was already at the workbench putting tools away. He may or may not have heard. He didn't respond, which was fine. She hadn't said it for a response. She had said it because it was true, and true things sometimes needed to be said out loud, even when there was no one to receive them. She let go of the door frame and went to help with the afternoon feed. At the end of the day, Howard counted her payment into her hand. 25 cents, the same as every day, counted precisely. Then he said, already turning back toward the barn, good work today. Ilsa stood in the yard with the coins in her palm. The afternoon had produced a fixed door, a borrowed technique, and a conversation about 2 boys watching a fire. One who didn't cry, and one who cried for both of them. She wasn't sure what category any of it belonged to. She wasn't sure it needed one. She put her other hand in her other pocket, where the pencil was, and then took it back out without taking the pencil with it. Some things you didn't need to hold to know they were there. Back at camp, the evening had settled into its familiar shape. Agnes at the English class table. She was reading independently now, the primer open, but mostly for reference. Patricia Crane watching with the expression of a teacher who has run out of things to correct. 3 other women at the table. The common room busier than it had been a month ago, which happened so gradually that you only noticed it when you looked for it. Marta was not at the window tonight. She was on her bunk, sitting upright, her book open in her lap. Her jaw had the tightness it had developed in the past week, not constant, but returning, a compression she would release and then find herself doing again without noticing. She looked at Ilsa when she came in. You're humming, she said. Ilsa stopped. She hadn't known she was. Something tuneless, Marta said. She looked back at her book. You should be careful. Contentment is the most effective cage of all. You don't even feel the bars. Agnes looked up from her primer. Ilsa sat on her bunk and thought about the barn door and the plugs and Howard's voice saying most men don't want the wars they end up in and the afternoon light on the sawdust. She thought about her father's workshop and the tuneless whistling when the work was going right. Perhaps, she said, some things are not cages. Marta said nothing. She turned a page. Agnes looked between them, and then back at her primer, and said nothing either, which was Agnes's way of having an opinion without spending it yet. The camp settled into the night. Outside the fence the Kansas dark was absolute and full of stars, the kind of dark you only got this far from a city, the kind that made the sky seem deeper than it had any business being. Ilsa lay back and let the day come to rest. Tomorrow was 7 o'clock. Sunday at the Callaway farm meant the morning started earlier and ended later than any other day. Not because there was more work, Sunday was lighter, the heavy fieldwork rested, the animals tended with the same care, but without the urgency of a production day. It started earlier because Ruth cooked on Sunday the way she did nothing else all week, with the specific, unhurried seriousness of someone for whom feeding people was not a task, but a practice. By the time Ilsa arrived at 7 the kitchen was already warm and smelled of something that had been in the oven since before light. Ruth handed her the apron at the door. Pie first, she said. Then the roast. Pie meant pastry, which meant cold butter cut into flour with 2 knives in a specific crossing motion that Ruth demonstrated once and expected to be reproduced correctly. Ilsa's first attempt was too warm, her hands too much in it, the butter softening before it should. Ruth looked at it, said nothing, put it in the icebox for 10 minutes, and when it came out showed her again. Cold hands, Ruth said. My mother said a good pastry cook is born in January. When were you born? August. Ruth said it with the expression of someone who has made peace with an irony. I learned the hard way. Ilsa tried again with colder hands. Better. Not right yet, but better. And Ruth said so. Better. In the plain way she assessed everything, as fact rather than encouragement, which was more useful than encouragement, and both of them knew it. The roast went in. The pastry went in. The kitchen settled into the long middle part of Sunday, cooking where everything was in its correct place, and doing what it needed to do without intervention, and Ruth and Ilsa moved around each other in the space with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms without negotiating them. Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at Ilsa's end of the table. She sat down. This was new. Ruth sitting. Ruth was not generally a sitting person during kitchen hours. Ilsa sat across from her and held the cup and waited. Howard tells me you fixed the barn door, Ruth said. He fixed it. I held things. He said you knew the technique with the plugs. Ruth looked at her over her cup. He doesn't say things like that about most people. Ilsa didn't answer. There wasn't a response to it that didn't sound like either false modesty or something worse. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window the Kansas Sunday was assembling itself, the light coming full and unhurried across the fields, the distant sound of Howard in the barn, a bird somewhere, doing something repetitive and unconcerned. Can I ask you something personal? Ruth said. Yes. Your mother. Are you close? Ilsa considered the word close and what it contained. We were, she said. Before the war made everything smaller. You stop saying real things when you are afraid. And then you lose the habit. Ruth nodded slowly. Not with sympathy exactly, with recognition. The nod of someone who understands the specific mechanism being described. Are you afraid of her? No. I am of what saying real things might cost. Who might hear? What they might do with it. She paused. In Germany, you learn to be careful about rooms. Careful about rooms, Ruth repeated. She seemed to be weighing the phrase. That must be exhausting. You stop noticing it, Ilsa said. Like the cold. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then, what was she like? Before. And Ilsa found, to her mild surprise, that she wanted to answer this. Not the careful answer, not the abbreviated answer, but the real one. Her mother at the kitchen window on Thursday mornings watching the street. Her mother's specific laugh that started silent before it found its sound. Her mother's habit of humming while she read, as though the two activities naturally belonged together. She told Ruth these things in the imperfect English she had been assembling for 5 weeks, the sentences sometimes stopping and restarting, the right word occasionally missing and replaced by a gesture or a simpler word that wasn't quite right, but was close enough. Ruth listened the way she did everything, with full attention, no interruption, asking the next question only when the previous one had finished completely. She sounds wonderful, Ruth said. She is. Ilsa corrected herself. I don't always. I sometimes forget she is still there. It has been so long. Ruth was quiet. She got up and checked the roast, opened the oven, looked, closed it, and came back to the table. Can I ask you something else? Yes. Ruth looked at her cup. Is there someone? A young man? Ilsa almost smiled. The question was so specific, so Ruth. The particular interest of a woman who had been hoping her sons would find someone and had been watching a young woman in her kitchen for 5 weeks. There was, Ilsa said. Before. A boy from my school. We grew up on the same street. He went east in 42. East. Russia. A pause. He didn't come back. Ruth set her cup down. She didn't say I'm sorry. She said something better, which was nothing, which was simply remaining in the room with the fact of it without trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. After a moment she said, "You're very young to have lost so much." "Everyone my age has," Ilse said. Not with bitterness, with the specific flatness of a statement that is simply true and has been true long enough to stop producing feeling every time it is said. Ruth looked at her. "That doesn't make it smaller." The roast came out at noon. Howard came in from the barn and washed his hands at the sink and sat at the table and bowed his head. His grace was the same 4 sentences it always was, and the same 2 names in the middle of it, Robert and Thomas, said with the same careful plainness that made them sound like people in the room rather than people somewhere far away and dangerous. He said amen and picked up his fork. They ate without much conversation. The Sunday meal was like that, self-sufficient, the food doing the work. Ilse ate the pie she had helped make, which was better than she had expected and worse than Ruth's, and Ruth said so plainly. "Yours is the one on the left. It's a little tough in the crust, but the filling is right," which was more satisfying than if she had said it was good. After the meal, Howard took his coffee to the porch. Ruth began clearing plates. Ilse carried Howard's plate to the sink and stood at the window, looking out at the yard, the barn, the field beyond it, the enormous Kansas sky doing nothing in particular above everything. She heard Ruth behind her, moving between the table and the counter, and then Ruth stopped and was still for a moment and said something quietly. Not to Ilse, the volume of it was private, directed at the middle distance or at Howard's back on the porch, or perhaps at no one in particular. "She reminds me of what Thomas would have been if we'd had a girl." She said it the way you say something you have been thinking for a while and have finally said by accident, not performing it, not offering it, simply finally saying it because it had been waiting long enough. Then she went back to the plates. Ilse stood at the window with the warm water running over her hands and the yard outside doing its ordinary Sunday things and the sentence settling into her the way certain sentences settle, not loudly, not with drama, but with the specific weight of something true that lands in a place that has been empty and fits it exactly. She did not turn around. She did not say anything. She finished the dishes. The drive back to camp was quiet. The other women were in the truck, Greta and Clara beside her on the bench. The Kansas evening pulling the light out of the sky in long horizontal bands of gold and amber. Nobody spoke. The road ran straight through the wheat fields the same way it always ran, flat and certain, leading back to the fence and the gate and the barracks. Ilse held the day in her hands the way you hold something you are not ready to put down yet. The barn door. The cold butter. Her mother at the kitchen window. She reminds me of what Thomas would have been. She had not cried at the sink. She had not cried in the truck. She would not cry in the barracks because the barracks was not a room for that. Not with Marta's eyes in it. Not with the specific armor you assembled every morning before roll call and did not remove until lights out. But something had happened in Ruth's kitchen today that she did not have a word for yet. Something had been said, without being said to her, that had reached a place inside her that had been sealed for so long, she had forgotten the seal was there. She would think about it later, alone, in the dark after lights out when the barracks was breathing around her and nobody was watching anything. For now the truck ran straight down the flat road, and the sky went gold, and then amber, and then the gray-blue of a Kansas evening coming in over the fields. The camp gate, the barracks, the shelf with the coins, and the pencil. Agnes looked up when she came in. One look at Ilse's face, and she asked nothing. Marta was on her bunk. Her jaw had the tightness again, worse tonight than it had been, a controlled rigidity that she released, and then found herself doing again. She had eaten dinner in the mess hall and come back and opened her book and had not, as far as Agnes could tell, read a single page. "Good Sunday," Marta said. The tone was even, not sarcastic, not warm. Simply the question in its plainest form, asked by someone who was going to listen to the answer whether she wanted to or not. "Yes," Ilse said. "What did you do?" "Cooked." "Talk. About what?" Ilse sat on her bunk and looked at the shelf. "Family," she said. "Mothers. People who didn't come back from Russia." The room was very quiet. Marta looked at her book. The jaw tightened again. She did not say anything, which was unusual. Marta generally had the next sentence ready before the previous one had finished. The silence where the sentence should have been was its own kind of information. Agnes noticed. She said nothing, which was Agnes saying everything. Ilse lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling and let the day finish itself. Outside, the Kansas night was doing what it always did, settling in over the camp and the farm and the fields between them with the same complete, indifferent darkness that had been settling here long before any of them arrived, and would keep settling long after all of them had gone home, to whatever home meant now. "She reminds me of what Thomas would have been." Ilse closed her eyes. She was not going to cry. She cried anyway, quietly, into the pillow, with the specific silence of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has learned to make it invisible. In the morning she would be fine. Tonight, she let herself be otherwise. The tooth had been wrong for 3 weeks. Not constant, that was the problem. If it had been constant, Marta could have categorized it, managed it, filed it under things to endure the way she filed most physical discomfort. But it came and went with the specific unreliability of something that was getting worse by increments small enough to deny. A pressure after eating. A sharpness when the air came in cold at roll call. A deep ache at night that arrived around 11 and left around 2 and left her lying in the dark with her jaw in her hand and her book closed and nothing to do but wait for it to stop. She had told no one. This was not stubbornness for its own sake. Or not only that. It was a calculation, the same calculation she applied to everything in this camp. What does asking for something cost, and who benefits from you needing it? The medical building was staffed by American soldiers. Asking them for help meant demonstrating need, which meant demonstrating vulnerability, which meant giving them something they could use. She had watched the way the camp operated for 6 weeks, and she had not yet identified the mechanism by which the kindness would be converted into leverage, but she had not stopped looking. It was there somewhere. Everything was a system. Systems had purposes. The tooth ached. She went to breakfast and drank her coffee on the side that didn't hurt, and said nothing. Agnes had begun spending her evenings differently. This was something Marta tracked without meaning to. The subtle reconfigurations of a small space that happen when a person's attention shifts. Agnes at the English class table 3 nights a week, now 4. Agnes asking Ilse questions about the farm in the evenings, real questions, specific ones. What does the morning smell like? What do the animals do when she comes in? What does Howard say when something goes wrong? Agnes writing longer letters home, the kind that required thinking between sentences. Agnes was leaning. Marta could see the angle of it even if Agnes hadn't named it yet to herself. She did not address this directly. There was no argument to make against curiosity. Curiosity was not loyalty or its absence. It was simply attention pointing somewhere, and attention could be redirected. What concerned her more was the thing she couldn't argue against. The fact that Ilse came back from the farm every evening changed in a way that was not performance. Marta had spent 4 years in an organization that trained people to perform contentment, loyalty, conviction. She knew what performance looked like from the inside. The thing on Ilse's face when she came through the barracks door in the evenings was not performance. This was, if she was being precise, the most troubling data point she had encountered since arriving at Camp Hayes. She pressed her tongue against the tooth. The ache flared and subsided. She picked up her book. Monday morning Ilse did not come back from the farm at 4 o'clock. Danny's truck arrived with Greta and Clara, but not Ilse. Corporal Whitfield received a telephone call from the Callaway property at 4:15 and made a note in his log. Brenner, I. Unwell, remaining at farm overnight, returning Tuesday morning, and filed it with the same procedural calm with which he filed everything. He posted the note on the administration board. Agnes read it. She came back to the barracks and told Marta. Marta said, "They kept her." "She's unwell," Agnes said. "Yes." Marta set her book down. "And they kept her." Agnes looked at her. "Is that not simply decent?" "It is precisely decent," Marta said. "That is what I said." She picked her book back up. Agnes sat on her bunk and looked at her hands. The evening passed in its normal shape. Dinner, the common room, the English class, lights out. But something in the barracks was different in Ilse's absence, a particular quality of the air, as though the room had been slightly rearranged while they weren't looking, and everything was in almost the right place. Marta lay in the dark with the tooth aching and thought about they kept her. She had no cage for it that fit properly. She had told Ilse that kindness was extended to useful people and withdrawn from useless ones, that the warmth of the American family was a function of Ilse's labor and would not survive the labor's absence. And now Ilse was sick and useless, and they had put her in a spare room and kept her. It did not disprove the argument entirely. There were other explanations: Geneva Convention requirements, the camp's liability for prisoner welfare, the family's interest in maintaining access to a worker they had invested weeks in training. Marta ran through them methodically. They were all technically sufficient. None of them satisfied her the way they should have. The tooth ached. She pressed her jaw into the pillow and waited for 2 o'clock. Ilse came back Tuesday morning before roll call. She came through the barracks door with the specific quality Marta had been tracking all month, that thing on her face that was not performance. But tonight it was different. Quieter. Something had happened that had gone deeper than the usual farm observations, deeper than the rutabaga and the baker and the neighbor's tractor. Something had reached a place that those things hadn't reached. She set her things on the shelf. She sat on her bunk. She looked at the ceiling. Agnes was watching her. What happened? Ilse was quiet for a moment. Then she described it. The afternoon, The spare room, Ruth making tea. The lullaby. She sang to me, she said. I didn't understand the words. It didn't matter. A pause. It was the kind of song you sing to someone because they need it, not because anything requires you to. Agnes said nothing. The room was very still. In the morning, Ilse continued. Her voice was careful, the way you are careful with something that is still fragile from being new. Howard at the table with his newspaper. The same grace, Robert and Thomas, and then he said something new. One sentence. She paused. He said, and watch over Ilse this morning, that she might get well. He didn't look up. He just said it, and picked up his fork. The barracks was completely quiet. And then he said there was coffee. Agnes looked at Marta. Marta was sitting upright on her bunk, her book closed in her lap. She was looking at Ilse with an expression Agnes had not seen on her before, not the controlled assessment, not the patient methodology. Something that had no name yet, because Marta had not decided what to do with it. You were sick, Marta said. Her voice was even. You could not work. And they kept you. Yes. And in the morning, he said the grace. Yes. And said your name in it. Yes. Marta was quiet. Her jaw was tight. She looked at her book, not reading it, simply looking at it. And then she looked at the wall. Everyone at the table heard it, she said. Not as an argument. As a fact she was processing out loud without meaning to. Yes, Ilse said. He knew. Another silence. Agnes held very still. Marta turned to face the wall. Agnes looked at Ilse. Ilse looked at the shelf, the coins, the pencil, and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The argument had been made by a spare room, and a lullaby, and 4 plain sentences before breakfast, and Marta had heard every word of it. And the wall she had turned to face was doing its best, but Agnes could see from across the room that the wall was not enough tonight. 3 days later Marta went to the medical building. She went in the early afternoon, between the end of kitchen detail and the beginning of free time, when the yard was quiet and most women were inside. She did not tell Agnes. She did not tell Ilse. She walked across the yard with her arms at her sides and her back straight and her jaw set against the ache that had been set against her for 3 weeks. The medical building was a single-room structure at the north end of the camp, clean, functional, a desk and 2 examination chairs and a cabinet of supplies along the back wall. She had passed it every day for 6 weeks and had not entered it. The soldier at the desk looked up when she came in. He was perhaps 30, with steady hands and the specific calm of someone who had been doing this long enough that other people's pain did not alarm him, but did interest him. His name tag said Webb. He was black. Something Marta registered in the first second with the full weight of everything she had been taught to think about what that meant, all of it arriving at once in the doorway before she had time to manage it. She stood in the doorway for a moment too long. Corporal Webb looked at her with the expression of a man who has seen this specific hesitation before and has decided, some time ago, how to respond to it, which was to respond to what came after it rather than to the hesitation itself. Sit down, he said, not unkindly. What's the trouble? She sat. She told him about the tooth, the pressure, the timing, the 3 weeks of it. He listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, put on his gloves, looked in her mouth with the small light. His hands were careful, the specific, professional carefulness of someone who understands that a person's mouth is a vulnerable place and treats it accordingly. He worked for 20 minutes. She felt pressure, and then relief, and then the particular emptiness of a space that has been in pain for so long that its absence feels like a new thing. He gave her a small paper with instructions, what to eat, what to avoid, when to come back if it flared again. Plain, specific, professional. That should hold now, he said. Come back if it flares up. He was already making a note in his log. His attention moved on to the next thing, the transaction complete from his side. Marta stood up. She folded the paper. She looked at Corporal Webb at his desk writing his note, his steady hands, his complete professional indifference to everything about her except the tooth, and felt the specific vertigo of a person whose framework has just been asked to accommodate something it was not built to hold. She had been taught a thing about people who looked like Corporal Webb. The teaching had been thorough and consistent, and had come from sources she had trusted because she had not yet understood that trust and truth were different categories. Corporal Webb had just treated her tooth with the same careful, unhurried competence he would have given anyone who sat in that chair. She walked out into the yard. The afternoon was warm and bright, the Kansas light doing nothing complicated, simply being light. She stood in it for a moment with the folded paper in her hand. She had no place to file this. She had run out of explanations that fit. The roast pork on Tuesday was a system. The pleasant guards were construction. The payment was transaction. The kindness toward Ilse was investment in a useful worker. Corporal Webb had cleaned her tooth and told her to come back if it flared up. She put the paper in her pocket. She did not throw it away. She walked back across the yard toward the barracks, and the afternoon continued around her. The women in the yard, the guards at their posts, the flag above the administration building moving in the slight Kansas wind. And Marta moved through all of it with her back straight and her arms at her sides, and the folded paper in her pocket, and the crack that had been opening in her since the night Ilsa described the lullaby now wide enough that she could no longer pretend it was something else. She did not tell anyone. She sat on her bunk and picked up her book and opened it to the page she had been on for 4 days. Agnes came in 20 minutes later and looked at her and looked away and said nothing. Marta read the same paragraph 3 times. Outside, the camp went about its afternoon, and somewhere 4 miles down a flat Kansas road Howard Calloway was in his field and Ruth was in her kitchen, and a barn door was opening and closing cleanly on its repaired hinge, and none of them knew that a woman in a barracks was sitting with a folded piece of paper in her pocket that she would not throw away because throwing it away would require a reason, and she had run out of reasons that held. The notice appeared on the administration board on a Thursday. It was written in German, in Corporal Whitfield's careful handwriting, and it said that the First Methodist Church of Hayes was organizing a community canning day the following Saturday, preserving the summer harvest for distribution to families of servicemen overseas, and that women from the camp were welcome to participate on a voluntary basis. Transportation would be provided. The day would run from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Lunch would be included. Ilsa read it twice. She thought about Marta's voice saying the church sends them, the English class volunteers, the friendly questions, the system behind the kindness. She thought about it, and then she signed her name and went back to the barracks. Agnes was at the table with her primer. Ilsa told her about the notice. Agnes closed the primer. She went to the board and read it, and came back and sat down and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she got up and signed her name. Neither of them mentioned this to Marta. Saturday morning the truck took 6 women into Hayes. Danny was behind the wheel with his clipboard, routing between the farm and the pharmacy, and now this. The church on Elm Street, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple and a parking area already filling with automobiles when they arrived. The church hall was at the back, a long room with high windows and wooden floors and 6 large tables running its length, each one already loaded with the morning's raw material. Bushels of tomatoes, crates of green beans, corn in its husks, peaches packed in wooden boxes that smelled of August, jars in their hundreds, clean and waiting, lined up along the back wall in the specific orderly abundance of a community that has been doing this together for a long time and knows exactly what it requires. Perhaps 30 women were already there when Ilsa and Agnes arrived. They moved between the tables with the ease of people who knew each other's names and each other's methods, and had strong opinions about both. The room smelled of hot water and fruit, and the particular warm density of a space full of purposeful work. A woman named Helen, wide, cheerful, with the authority of someone who had been running this operation for 20 years and intended to run it for 20 more, directed the camp women to the tomato table with the brisk welcome of someone who needed hands more than she needed introductions. Blanche, peel, pack, she said, demonstrating the sequence in about 8 seconds. You'll have it by the second jar. She was already moving to the next thing. Ilsa looked at Agnes. Agnes picked up a tomato. They started. The work was repetitive enough to leave the mind free and the ears open, which was, Ilsa came to understand, the specific social genius of canning. It gave 30 women something to do with their hands while they did what they had actually come to do, which was talk. Not quietly. Not with lowered voices or measured words, or the careful management of what was said in front of whom. Simply talk. The overlapping, interrupting, laughing, disagreeing talk of people who had no reason to monitor themselves because the room was safe, and had always been safe, and the concept of a room being otherwise had never been part of their experience. 2 women at the far end of the table were arguing about the town council. Not in the way Ilsa had heard political disagreement conducted, the careful, oblique, deniable kind, structured to leave no evidence. Openly. With specific names and specific complaints and specific counterarguments delivered at full volume to a room that was listening and not listening simultaneously. The way rooms do when an argument is familiar and ongoing and nobody needs to take sides because everyone already has won. Hendricks had no business approving that road contract without a public meeting, said a woman in a yellow apron. He had every business, said the woman beside her, not looking up from her tomatoes. The council voted. That's what the council is for. The council voted in March. The contract changed in June. That's not the same vote. Then take it up at the next meeting. That's what the next meeting is for. I intend to. Good. Bring Margaret. She talks faster. Laughter from 3 directions. The argument continued without heat, or rather with the specific heat of people who enjoy disagreeing with each other because the disagreement is safe and the relationship is not in danger, and the whole thing will probably continue over coffee afterward. Ilsa packed tomatoes and listened. Agnes was beside her, also listening, her movements slow and automatic, her attention entirely on the room. At the table behind them, two older women were discussing the pastor's sermon from the previous Sunday. "He went 20 minutes over," said the first. "It was a good sermon," said the second. "It was a good sermon that became a different sermon around the 40-minute mark, and that second sermon needed work. Dorothy, the man is doing his best. His best on Sundays is better than his best on, apparently, knowing when to stop." A pause. Then the second woman said, "The part about forgiveness was very good." "The part about forgiveness was excellent," the first agreed. "I just wish he'd gotten there sooner." They both laughed. They went back to their beans. Ilsa kept her eyes on her tomatoes. She was thinking about something she could not have named before this morning. The specific texture of a room where people said what they thought. Not every thought. Not carelessly. Not without consideration for the people around them. But what they thought. About the council, the pastor, the sermon, the contract, the next meeting. Margaret, who talked fast, said it out loud to whoever was in the room. And the room absorbed it, and responded, and continued, and nobody was taken away afterward. She had grown up in a country where this had stopped. Not suddenly. Gradually. The way the paint had stopped being maintained. The way the Thursday market had stopped being only a market. The careful sentence, the lowered voice, the word that stopped itself before the dangerous one. She had been so young when it started that she had absorbed the caution before she understood what she was being cautious about. It had become the weather. It had become the cold you stopped noticing. This room was not cold. This room was 30 women arguing about road contracts and sermon length and whether Margaret talked fast, and the temperature of it was something Ilsa did not have a word for in either language except that it was the opposite of careful, and it cost nothing, and it had apparently always been free. At 11 o'clock Helen called a break, and someone produced a coffee urn from the kitchen, and the room rearranged itself into the loose configuration of people who have been working alongside each other for 3 hours, and have earned the right to stand differently. A woman named Barbara, perhaps 45, with flour on her sleeve from something earlier in the morning, came to stand beside Ilsa at the window with her coffee. "You're from the camp," she said. Not unkindly. Simply placing the fact. "Yes," Ilsa said. Barbara nodded. "My nephew is in Germany right now. With the occupation." She looked out the window. "He writes that things are very hard there." "Yes," Ilsa said. "I think they are." Barbara was quiet for a moment. "Do you have family there?" "My mother. In Freiburg." "I hope she's all right," Barbara said. She said it the way Ruth said things. Plain, direct, meaning exactly what it said and nothing more or less. "Thank you," Ilsa said. Barbara refilled her coffee and went back to her table. Ilsa stood at the window and looked at Hayes, Kansas on a Saturday morning. The street outside, the automobiles, a child on a bicycle going past the church with the specific urgency of a child who has somewhere important to be. The ordinary, functioning, unburned world of a country that had not had a war inside its borders. She thought about Barbara's nephew in Germany, writing that things were very hard. She thought about her mother's kitchen window. She thought about the specific weight of the word hope when it was said by someone who had no reason to say it except that it was true. Agnes appeared beside her. They stood at the window together without speaking for a moment. "I'm going to sign the work list," Agnes said. "When we get back." She said it quietly, not as an announcement, as something she had decided, and was now simply reporting, the way you report facts. "I know," Ilsa said. Agnes looked at her. Was it obvious? Only to me. Agnes nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside, the child on the bicycle had reached wherever he was going and disappeared around a corner. "Do you think Marta will ever?" Agnes started. "I don't know," Ilsa said. They went back to their tomatoes. The afternoon was quieter, the work finding its rhythm, the conversations settling into the comfortable lower register of people whose energy has been spent on the morning and are now simply present together. Ilsa worked and listened and let the room be what it was. The overlapping voices, the specific smell of hot tomatoes and wood smoke from the canning stoves, the sound of jars being sealed, the occasional burst of laughter from the far table where the road contract argument had apparently resumed and found new material. At 2:30 Helen came to inspect the morning's production, row after row of sealed jars cooling on the back tables, labeled in careful handwriting, ready for distribution to the families of men overseas. She looked at the count and nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose system had produced what it was designed to produce. "Same time next month," she said, to the room in general. Several women said they would be there. One said she couldn't. Tuesdays were better for her. Could they do a Tuesday? Helen said they could not do a Tuesday. The woman said she would try to rearrange. Helen said good. Ilsa carried a tray of jars to the storage shelf and set them down carefully, one by one, in their row. Peaches, tomatoes, green beans, Each one sealed, labeled, going to a family somewhere in Kansas whose father or son or husband was overseas. She had spent the day alongside the women of Hays, Kansas, preserving food for strangers, and nobody had required anything of her except that she blanch and peel and pack, and the room had talked and argued and laughed around her without lowering its voice once. And Barbara had said, "I hope she's all right," about a woman she had never met and would never meet, and meant it, and that was the whole of it. She did not announce to herself that anything had changed. She simply set the last jar in the row and stepped back and looked at them, all those sealed jars in their neat line, each one that was holding. He tested it. Solid, no movement. He let go. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet. Not empty, not withholding, simply giving the words the space they deserved before he said anything back. "You did the work," he said. "Everything you learned here, you learned because you showed up at 7 o'clock and paid attention." He moved to the next post. "That's not something I gave you. That's something you did." Ilsa stood with the chalk in her hand. He tested the post. "Loose," she marked it. They moved on. "Your father," Howard said, after a few posts. "The carpenter." "Yes. He taught you to work right." "That's not nothing." A pause. "Man leaves something behind when he teaches his children how to show up." The fence line continued. The clouds built in the northwest. They worked to the end of the line and came back in the afternoon, moved the way afternoons moved here, at the pace of the task, complete in itself, not hurrying toward anything. At the end of the day, Ruth was waiting at the kitchen door. She had something in her hand, a folded piece of paper, the kind torn from the notepad she kept beside the stove. She held it out to Ilsa. "The biscuit recipe," she said. "The right way, written out properly." Ilsa took it. She unfolded it. Ruth's handwriting, clear and practical, each step numbered, the measurements precise, a note at the bottom that said "cold hands" underlined twice. "I already have your recipe," Ilsa said. "From the shelf." "That one's the working version," Ruth said. "All the corrections from when you did it wrong are in the margins. This one is clean." She looked at Ilsa with the directness she brought to everything. "For when you make it at home. For your mother." Ilsa looked at the paper. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket alongside the pencil. Ruth reached out and put her hand briefly on Ilsa's face. One hand, the side of her palm against Ilsa's cheek, the specific gesture of a woman saying something her language did not have a word for, or had too many words for, or had exactly the right word for, and chose not to use because the hand said it more truly. Then she went back inside. Ilsa stood at the kitchen door for a moment with the paper in her pocket and the Kansas evening assembling itself behind her, and the screen door closed between her and the kitchen where Ruth was already doing the next thing. Howard was at the truck. He had her payment ready. The 25 cents counted and held out the way he always held it, the correct conclusion of an exchange between two people who had each done what they agreed to do. She took it. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the fence line, the repaired posts, the straight wire, the north field beyond it going gold in the late light. 3 weeks, he said. "Yes." He nodded once. He looked at the field. "Good work today, kiddo." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, over his shoulder, already half turned back toward the barn, as though it were simply the next fact in a long sequence of facts, and required no more ceremony than any of the others. He went inside. Ilsa stood in the yard with the coins in her palm and the recipe in her pocket, and the pencil where it always was, and the Kansas evening going long in gold over everything. The barn, the field, the water tower, the enormous, unhurried sky doing what it always did above all of it. She did not move for a moment. She had been waiting for something since she was old enough to understand that the world was not what she had been told it was. She had not known she was waiting for it. She had not known it would arrive through a barn door and a pump and a grace said at breakfast, and a hand against her cheek, and 2 words said over a shoulder as a man walked back into his barn. She put the coins in her pocket. She walked to the truck, the camp gate, the barracks, the shelf. She put the coins down. She put the new recipe beside the old one. She looked at both of them for a moment. The working version with the corrections in the margins, the clean version for home. She took the pencil out of her pocket and set it on the shelf beside them. She stood there looking at it. Then she sat on her bunk and opened her diary to the last clean page and wrote 1 sentence. She closed the diary and put it on the shelf beside the pencil and lay back and looked at the ceiling. Agnes came in from the pharmacy shift 20 minutes later. She set her things down and looked at the shelf, the coins, the diary, the recipes, the pencil, and said nothing. She sat on her bunk and began writing her letter home with the ease of someone who has been finding the right words for weeks and has finally run out of wrong ones. Marta came in last. She had been in the common room, not at the English class table, simply in the room, sitting in the corner with her book while the class ran around her, which was different from being in the barracks alone with the book, and Agnes had noticed the difference even if Marta had not announced it. She set her book on her bunk. She looked at Ilsa. Ilsa looked back at her. Marta's jaw was not tight tonight. Whatever had been requiring management for the past 3 weeks was not requiring it in the same way. She looked older than she had in June. Not in the way of age, but in the way of someone who has put down something heavy and has not yet decided whether the feeling is relief or loss or both at once. She sat on her bunk. 3 weeks, she said. Yes, Ilsa said. Marta looked at the shelf, the pencil, the diary, the recipes. She looked at them the way she looked at most things, with attention, assessing, filing. But the filing mechanism had changed. Something in what she was doing with what she saw was different from what it had been in June. Different enough that Agnes noticed from across the room and looked carefully at the floor. Your mother will be glad to have you back, Marta said. It was a plain sentence. Nothing in it but what it said. Yes, Ilsa said. I think she will. Marta lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling. In her pocket the folded paper was still there. It had been there for 2 weeks. It would probably still be there when she boarded the transport, because throwing it away required a decision she had not yet made, and making a decision required admitting that the decision had become necessary, and admitting that was the last door, and she was standing in front of it with her hand on the frame, and she had not yet decided whether to go through. Agnes looked at Marta. She looked at Ilsa. She went back to her letter. Outside the camp the Kansas night arrived the way it always arrived. Complete, full of stars, but nothing had changed. She simply set the last jar in the row and stepped back and looked at them. All those sealed jars in their neat line, each one the work of someone's hands, each one going somewhere useful, and felt something in her chest settle into a position it had not occupied for a very long time. Not conclusion. Not conversion. Simply settlement. The specific quiet of a question that has been running for weeks and has finally, without drama, found its answer. The truck back to camp. The flat road, the wheat fields, the gate. The barracks. The shelf. The coins, and the pencil. Marta was on her bunk when they came in. She looked at Agnes first, the specific attention of someone who has been tracking an angle, and then at Ilsa. Agnes set her things down. She looked at Marta. I signed the work list, she said. This morning before we left. The room was quiet. Marta looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her book. The Callaway farm, she said. The pharmacy, Agnes said. In town. Marta nodded once. She turned a page. The page turn was too deliberate. The specific movement of someone controlling a response they have decided not to give. Agnes sat on her bunk. Ilsa sat on hers. Outside the camp the Kansas evening was coming in the same way it always came. Long and gold and indifferent, belonging to no one, available to everyone. The English class table in the common room would have its students tonight. The mess hall would have its dinner. The administration board would have its lists. Ilsa looked at the shelf. The coins. The pencil. The folded piece of paper from Ruth with the biscuit recipe on it, which she had put there 2 weeks ago, and which she had not yet decided what to do with, whether it was something to keep or something to lose or something in between that didn't have a name yet. She left it where it was. Tomorrow was 7 o'clock, and somewhere in the camp, in a pocket on a bunk, a folded piece of paper with aftercare instructions in Corporal Webb's handwriting was still where Marta had put it. Still there. Still unthrown. The notice went up on a Wednesday. Repatriation. Processing would begin in 3 weeks. Transport arranged through military channels. Women wishing to submit forwarding addresses for family notification should do so by Friday. Corporal Whitfield posted it at 7 in the morning, and by 7:15 every woman in the camp had read it. Ilsa read it twice. Then she went to breakfast. She ate her oatmeal and drank her coffee and looked at the table and thought about Freiburg, the street, the house, her mother's kitchen window. She thought about it the way you think about something you have been holding at a careful distance for so long that bringing it close again requires a specific kind of courage you have to locate before you can use it. 3 weeks. She put her spoon down and went to find Corporal Whitfield. She asked if she could continue working at the Callaway farm until the transport date. Whitfield looked at his calendar. He looked at his forms. He said he saw no reason why not, assuming the Callaways were agreeable, which he could confirm with a telephone call. He made the call while she waited. Ruth answered. Whitfield asked. A pause, and then he held the receiver slightly away from his ear because Ruth's answer, whatever it was, required a volume that the telephone did not strictly need. He hung up. 7 o'clock, he said. Same as always. Howard was in the East Field when Ilsa arrived that morning. Ruth met her at the door with the apron and something that had been in the oven since early, and the specific expression of a woman who has received news and has decided how she feels about it, and is not going to perform any of that for anyone. They worked through the morning without mentioning repatriation. The kitchen, The animals, the rhythm of the place that Ilsa now moved through without needing direction. The chickens fed, the pump worked, the feed carried, the dough started. Each task finding her the way tasks find people who belong to a space. At noon Howard came in from the field. He washed his hands at the sink and looked at Ilsa at the table with the dough and said nothing. He sat down. Ruth brought the food. He bowed his head. Lord, thank you for this table and the hands that prepared it. Watch over Robert and Thomas wherever they are this morning. Watch over Ilsa as she goes home. A pause. The briefest one, the kind that is barely a pause but is not nothing. Amen. He picked up his fork. Ruth picked up hers. Ilsa looked at her plate for a moment. Then she picked up her fork too. The afternoon Howard took her to the north fence line to check the posts before the autumn weather arrived. The work was simple. Each post tested for stability, the loose ones marked for repair, the wire checked for breaks. They moved down the line together, Howard at each post, Ilsa with the marking chalk. The Kansas sky above them was doing what it did in September, enormous, active, building something in the northwest that might be weather by evening. Howard looked at it twice in the first hour. Rain tonight, he said. How can you tell? He pointed at the cloud formation in the northwest, the specific shape of it, the color at the base. My father showed me. His father showed him. He tested a post. You pay attention long enough to one sky, it starts to tell you things. Ilsa looked at the clouds. She tried to see what he was seeing. What else does it tell you? Cold coming in 2 weeks. Early this year. He moved to the next post. Good harvest before it gets here if the weather holds through next week. She watched him work. The post tested, marked or passed, moved on. The same unhurried competence he brought to everything. The fence line ran straight toward the horizon, and beyond it the wheat field, and beyond that the flat distance of Kansas going about its business. Howard, she said. He looked at her. I want to tell you something. She had been carrying this since breakfast, and she had decided on the walk down from the house that she was going to say it plainly, without management, the way Ruth had taught her things were said in this kitchen. When I came here I believed. I had been told things. About Americans. About what this country was. She paused. I believe them the way you believe things when you have never had a reason to look at them directly. Howard was listening. He did not prompt her. Everything I was told was wrong, she said. Not in a large way. In a small way. In the way of a barn door, and a neighbor's tractor, and a bag of rolls, and a grace said at breakfast. She stopped. I don't think this room would be empty. The shelf would be bare. Corporal Whitfield would have his forms completed and filed. The truck would have made its last run down the flat road. The Callaway farm would still be there. Howard would still be reading the newspaper about the mayor. Ruth would still be making biscuits on Sunday mornings. The barn door would open and close cleanly on its repaired hinge, the plug set solid in the wood, the technique of a carpenter from Freiburg holding everything in place. And somewhere in Germany, in a kitchen in Freiburg, a woman would eventually hear a knock at the door and open it, and find her daughter standing there with 25 cents in her pocket, and 2 recipes, and a carpenter's pencil, and something in her face that had not been there when she left. Her mother would not have a word for it. She wouldn't need one. Epilogue. Ilsa Brenner returned to Freiburg in October 1945. She taught school for 31 years. She made biscuits on Sunday mornings for the rest of her life. On the shelf above her kitchen window, she kept a carpenter's pencil and 2 folded recipes, one with corrections in the margins. Agnes Free stayed in Germany, married a man from Hamburg, and every year until she died sent a Christmas card to the First Methodist Church of Hayes, Kansas, addressed to Helen, whose last name she had never learned. Marta Vogel did not speak about the camp for 20 years. When she finally did, to her daughter, in a kitchen in Munich, over coffee, she spoke for 3 hours without stopping. Her daughter asked what had changed her. Marta was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, a dentist with steady hands and 4 words. Her daughter asked what the 4 words were. Marta said, come back if needed. Howard and Ruth Callaway received a letter from Germany in December 1945, written in careful English, about a barn door and a biscuit recipe and a grace said at breakfast with a name in it. Ruth read it to Howard at the kitchen table. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the window for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and went back to the newspaper. Robert and Thomas Callaway both